Hello everyone, I'm Duke Doc. For those of you who don't know me, I'm from the Middle Kingdom. I've been king there 7 times. I've been a finalist and crowned about twice that many times. I've been fighting since 1981, and the last time I was in the finals was the crown before last. So that's it for credentials. I've been seeing a lot of great stuff pop up lately on YouTube while everybody's quarantined, just like me. Doing some really good stuff for training. There's some new groups on Facebook starting that I'd like to contribute to. So I'm going to start out with some very basic stuff. Maybe I'll move on to some more advanced things. But there are maybe better guys to teach the more advanced stuff. I've gotten away from trying to teach techniques, and I'm trying to just impart principles so that people can become better fighters. I don't want you to fight like me. I don't want you to fight like anybody but yourself. I want you to fight like you, only better. So while you're training, I want to give you some principles and some truths that I have found that you can keep in mind whenever you're practicing something or trying to add a new technique to your arsenal. Okay? So the first thing we're going to talk about, the first thing everybody should learn is stance. Your stance. Your stance, nobody else's. Everybody's stance is going to be different. There are some similarities, and that's what we're going to talk about. Some conventions, okay? So when I'm starting with a brand new person, somebody who's never fought, certainly never done any sword combat, has no martial arts training, I start out with sort of an exercise to take their mind out of fighting and into their body a little bit. And I just try and get everybody to line up on a line. I'll just pick an arbitrary line on the ground, and I'll get everybody lined up, and I'll tell them to focus on a point in the distance. Then I'll say, all right, standing start, we're going to race to that point. The only caveat I'll give them is if you're right-handed, I want you to start with your left foot forward, and vice versa. Okay, so get them all in line. On your mark, get set, and then I tell them, don't move. I want them to look down at their feet, see where their hips are, how their knees are bent, okay? Because what you've just accomplished there is, this is how your body thinks it can move quickly. This is what's natural to you. This is what you can assume without really thinking about it. And that's really what your stance has to be. It has to be something that you don't think about, that you can adopt automatically, that you can drop into in a moment's notice. When you're on guard, when you're not thinking about anything else, you can just drop into your stance. A couple of small things that I may correct when I've got them standing in a line is, well, if your foot is too far perpendicular to your line of attack, that disengages the calf muscle. So you want that in there. So you want to bring that toe forward more, not parallel with your front foot, maybe at a 45 degree, somewhere in there. That's going to be up to you too, all right? But you want the ball of the foot forward because that will engage the calf muscle and allow you that spring in your step that you need to change range quickly. The left foot would be generally just to one side, the outside of the center line of your opponent. If you can get your opponent inside your foot, that's great, but I find it easier if your foot is pointing towards the direction you want to move, your knee is lined up and it's stronger and less likely to be damaged in a quick movement, okay? So this is what we would call an orthodox stance. Boxers would call this an orthodox stance, right? The right-handed boxer. But there are lots of other stances, lots of other types of stances. Some will want you to square up completely to your opponent. That's got its advantages and disadvantages, and that's what I want to point out through all of this series, that everything is a trade-off. Everything is either something you gain and then you give up something else, right? With the squared up stance, you have increased what sometimes we call your attack arc, which is about 45 degrees from your center line in both directions, even with your legs. Now your opponent then is right in the center of that, right? So if your opponent moves one way or another, you've got lots of time to track them and keep them in your attack arc. However, this squared up stance, the problem with it is that, the advantage is that you can move laterally really well. But it's a lot more difficult to change range quickly from this stance. You have to unbalance yourself quite a bit. To sit back and push your hips backwards and then catch up with your feet, which is kind of what, as bipeds, we do anyway when we're walking, is we fall forward, we catch ourselves, and we fall forward again and catch ourselves. That's what walking really is. So, however, the disadvantage is if your hips are moving backwards, you can't throw with power. You can't throw a shot while you're retreating if your hips are out from underneath your chest, okay? Most of our movement's rotational, and we'll get into that later when I'm talking about range and power generation. For now, stance, there's the orthodox we talked about, square, and then there's what we sometimes call goofy foot or sword forward stance, which would be this. This also has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is, fairly obviously, that I've just moved a little closer to my opponent. My sword shoulder is now nearer my opponent. It gives me a little bit of a range advantage. The disadvantage, one of the disadvantages, is that it now exposes my unshielded leg is now closer to my opponent. It's more exposed. It's harder for me to block across to that leg that's now easier for my opponent to reach. The plus side, I guess, is that this is now taken further away from my opponent. The other sort of primary disadvantage is that now I don't have my body anymore to power the shot. So most guys who use this style will put their right foot forward, but they'll start with their shoulder back. This works, but I would call it kind of advanced. The thing is, your body is going to be under constant torsion all the time. And we'll get into that also when I talk about power generation. So your hips are 90 degrees from your shoulders in this stance. Your shield is still forward and your sword is still back, right? But if your hips aren't in that same orientation, your obliques are going to be under some tension all the time. The advantage that extra range gives you is if you're a very tall fighter, 6'4", 6'6", you've added to that great advantage. If you're a short fighter, you've mitigated some of your disadvantage of not having the same range as your opponent. So it's got its uses, but again, I would call it advanced because power generation is a whole, you got to do a whole different thing with power generation. So that's where your feet are, and it's important because the power comes from the ground. Your interface with the ground is where your power comes from, and that's not just the turning motion, that's also the changing weight, shifting your weight forward towards your opponent. Like boxers. Boxers don't just fight with their muscles. Although they're pretty big guys, mostly they are trying to fight with their weight. That's why they have weight classes and why weight classes exist. Right? A 300-pound guy can hit harder generally than a 150-pound guy. So that's where your feet are and how you can change range. This orthodox stance now, I guess I should give a second to talk about a fencer's T stance. Body turned away, hand extended, because this is your offense and your defense when you're fencing. So you turn the body away to limit the target. And this stance, if you're fencing on a strip, like a sport fencer, this allows you to change range very quickly. They put their back foot perpendicular to their movement, I've been told, because it gives you more traction. It's a larger contact patch, just like the wide tires on a dragster. Okay? So that makes some sense. It doesn't make a lot of sense for us because we're trying to actually generate power. All they are trying to do is reach. Okay? So, as I said, everybody's stance is unique, is different. It's going to be what you need it to be. So everywhere from here in the sword forward stance, right, all the way back to here, have their uses. The more in line your feet are, the quicker you can change range. The more square you are, the more quickly you can move laterally. That should make sense. But what you're looking for, or what everybody is going to be sort of looking for, is the compromise between those two things. Even this right foot forward, your feet are kind of at 45 degrees from your line of movement. Same with orthodox, it's just a switch. So you're looking for that compromise that allows you to move right and left and forward and back. And I think you will find, if you watch carefully, most fighters, even if they start squared off, as the fight progresses, they will become more and more compromised in their stance because they are having to change range during that whole fight. Okay? Separate from stance, and I'm trying to save some of this for the little power generation I want to do next, is hand position. This is also part of your stance. Hand, head, body, all of this is your stance. So in general, you want to be upright, right? You want your hips underneath your chest and your head above that, your hands out in front. Now, I have talked to people about thinking of your helmet as a bucket on a broom handle. And you're trying to balance that bucket on that broom handle, and the broom handle is your spine. So you want to be, when you're at rest, or when you are at distance, or when you're haven't actually entered the fight yet, you want to be upright and relaxed. This allows your neck, takes some of the strain off your neck of the weight of your helmet if you can just balance it on the top of your spine. Okay? Does that make sense? Also allows you, when you are moving in this rotational way, you're rotating around an axis that's straight up and down. If you tilt forward and you try and move around that axis, your angle of attack moves. If you're leaned back, it moves up like this. All right? I'll get into that a little bit too in range. So you're looking for the compromise between here and here. It may be shorter. The distance, having your feet shoulder width apart, allows you to keep balance and allows more weight on your feet. That gives you good traction. It's easy to do. It's less tiring than if you're wide spread like this. It's going to put strain on your joints, strains on your hips, and requires a little more energy. It allows you to move a little bit more quickly, but again, it's a compromise. So, anyway, went through the body, now to the hands. Styles are going to vary widely, and I'm not going to get too much into different shield styles, okay? Generally, just like a boxer, you want your hands in front of you, where you can see them. Not down here, not up here, here. You want them relaxed. You want your elbows close to your sides, your shoulders relaxed so that the elbows can kind of hang there, and your hands in front so that you can carry the weight of your weapon and your shield on top of your forearm, and you're not constantly holding them up this way. Okay? That's just a basic. I'll grab a sword. So, that's here. Now, this is another sort of compromise thing. I've seen, this is what we used to call the old castle style. The advantages to this, and there are some, your arm is way out of range. Nobody's going to hit that arm while you're in your basic stance. Okay? The sword is laying behind you. The mechanical advantage to that is that when you start moving your body, that weight is close to your center of rotation, and it doesn't require much effort to move it, and you can start moving it very quickly. Okay? And the sword comes around this way when you're using this sort of stance. All right? More common, I think you will find people using what's called an A-frame, where their sword is in front of their head. Okay? This is very useful, it can be very good, but it is a highly defensive style. This is going to get into generation of power a little bit, but it's important. Your sword has to travel through a certain distance. If you're allowing the sword to do the work, it has to travel a certain distance for it to have enough power to count, to be a good blow. All right? The closer it is to your opponent to start, the more power you have to put into it with your muscles. it's kind of a esoteric kind of a point, but what's important is your hand, the distance from your hand, or from your hand to your shoulder, should be about that far, about a hand span. All right. If you get out here, you've lost the power to generate force. You've lost the ability to generate enough power. The only way you can generate power from here is to punch, which is going to put a stress on your shoulder. And you're going to have to lock your elbow so that you are transferring more of your weight into the sword. You're going to lock your wrist, and you're going to get a death grip on your sword, because this all has to become one rigid thing for it to transfer the momentum of your body. Right? One of the principles I want you to think about, and I'll go back. My sword position is usually here. My hand position is the same, right? Sword's laying right along my temple. Right? That will block. It's a tiny movement to block anything that comes in offside. Right? My elbow's still behind my hand. Same with this. Right? Position is the same. But I'm also carrying the weight more easily. If I'm out here, I'm having to maintain that weight out there at the end of my arm all the time. That's tiring. The more tired you are, the less precise you are. So, back here, right? Again, this distance. We'll get into sword mechanics too a little bit, probably the next one. But I want you to think about the efficiency of the movement and reducing tells. If your sword's back here, your body's moving before your sword is moving towards your opponent. And the blade of the sword is moving through a very, 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 very long arc before it meets its target. That can generate quite a lot of force. That's good. If you're out here, your sword has a very short distance to travel. That's also good, but it requires you to provide the power. The sword doesn't have it in it. If that makes any sense. Right? So my compromise here, for me, is the sword tip where I'm going to strike my opponent's back here. And it has to move from here to my opponent's head. Now, this, for me, is the shortest distance I can move it and still have enough momentum for it to strike and be a good blow. But the advantage is that it doesn't ever move away from your opponent. Anytime your sword is moving away from your opponent, you are wasting time. And everything's a race. Offense against defense. Okay? My race is this part of my sword has to travel all the way to my opponent's head. Well, let's use Mr. Pell here. So, from this position, my blade has to move from all the way back here, all the way to there. Now, if I'm here, it's a much shorter, obviously it's a much shorter distance, but I have to pack a lot more power into it with a punch for it to count. Back here, my hand is moving a little more, and that is a tell. Because my hand is moving long before my blade actually starts moving towards my opponent. But it can work. I mean, that's a lot of power there, and it's effortless. This, most effort. So my compromise is here. I've got a good defense here. This also doesn't block my head very well. This blocks everything very extremely well. But you don't want to be out here. You'll see a lot of people who are starting with the A-frame be out here because it's all their defense is pushed out as far as they can. Right? Better practitioners, more experienced fighters, they'll keep that A-frame in much closer, much tighter. Right? Maybe a little further than I'm talking about. If you've got the upper body strength and you want to do that, you can. You'll have some success with it, but you are going to be taxing your shoulder and your elbow and your wrist all the time. Okay? Plus, I want you to note, most people, if their sword is out here in front of them, to throw an onside shot, the tip will move back. Now, there it is, it's gaining that distance that I'm talking about, that arc that it has to go through to have enough momentum. But part of that is moving away from your opponent. that is time your opponent has to read what the shot is or to react to it in some way, just step out of range. So keep that in mind when you're trying to decide on what style is going to work best for you. I think that's it for stance. I think from stance we're going to go to basic power generation, and I may even treat you to the 4 cardinal blows. So thanks for watching. Talk to you next time. I'm Duke Doc.